The gate swung open, and a man was dead before anyone had time to react. That is the kind of war this was. Not heroic charges and dramatic last stands, but mud and fog and a gate swinging open at the wrong moment. Have you ever read a first-hand account from the Eastern Front that actually felt real? Not like a history book, but like something that happened to a person? And what do you think it felt like to be an ordinary soldier caught inside a machine that was far bigger than any one man? This is the story of one soldier moving through one of the most brutal campaigns in human history. The German push toward the Caucasus in the winter of 1941. Not a general, not a hero from a textbook, just a man laying telephone cable, drinking champagne in a bombed-out office, and watching the world around him unravel one frozen kilometer at a time. It begins in November 1941, in the early hours before dawn, when the ground finally did something useful for the German advance. It froze solid. For weeks, the infamous Russian mud had turned roads into traps, swallowing wheels and tracks whole. But now the frost had arrived and hardened the earth into something that could actually hold the weight of an army. Tanks rolled, trucks moved, personnel carriers cut across open terrain without sinking to their axles, and the city of Rostov-on-Don, the gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus, was now close enough to almost smell. At 3 in the morning on November 17th, a fog rolled in so thick and cold that it seemed to swallow sound itself. Darkness deepened. The world shrank to a few meters in every direction, and somewhere in that darkness, soldiers were quietly being told what was coming. At 6 in the morning, a commanding officer gathered the men. He did not sugarcoat it. He told them a hard fight was ahead, and then he reminded them not to eat before going into battle, because abdominal wounds were likely, and food in the stomach made them worse. The men had heard this warning before, which meant they understood exactly what kind of day this would be. When the fog finally lifted with the first pale light of morning, it peeled back like a stage curtain to reveal the full theater of what was about to happen. Infantry companies moved forward, supported by mortar crews, machine gun teams, and assault guns that rolled directly into the fight without hesitation. Tanks from the 4th Company had also positioned themselves nearby, but they did something unusual. They fired a few rounds and then stopped. They did not advance. They held back. This was not cowardice. It was a specific fear. Ahead of the advancing troops lay deep anti-tank trenches, wide and steep-sided, the kind of obstacle a tank could slide into and never effectively get out of. Once a tank dropped into one of those trenches, it could not turn, it could not aim properly, and it became a target instead of a weapon. So the tank crews kept their distance, waiting for sappers to clear mines and find safe paths through. Meanwhile, the infantry and the assault guns pushed forward without them, which meant the soldiers on foot were moving into a city fight with less armored support than they had planned on. The rooftops of Rostov appeared on the horizon. 10 more kilometers passed. The unit dug in to wait for orders, but then something unexpected happened. The Russians pulled back, not in chaos, not in a rout, but quickly and with order, retreating before the Germans could surround them or pin them down. The moment the retreat became clear, any thought of holding position was abandoned. The pursuit began immediately, because every minute given to a retreating enemy is a minute they use to build the next defensive line. By the time the unit reached the outskirts of Rostov, they had outrun their own communications. No radio contact, no telephone connection, no way to reach the command post. The division commander sent 2 motorcyclists out along separate routes to re-establish contact, carrying with them the message that the unit intended to push all the way to the Don River, where 2 bridges waited. One a steel railway bridge, one a wooden crossing for vehicles and troops. The railway bridge was taken, but at the wooden bridge, something went wrong. Ammunition was running low, and a large formation of Russian troops crossed before they could be stopped. The retreat on the other side of that bridge was disciplined and swift. In the days that followed, the soldiers who had watched those Russians cross would come to deeply regret not stopping them. When the tank units from Guderian's army eventually rolled into Rostov, one of the Leibstandard officers did not hide his frustration. He confronted a tank commander directly and demanded to know where the armor had been, why it had not accompanied the infantry. The answer came back the same as before. They had been waiting for confirmed safe passages through the anti-tank ditches. It was a logical answer. It was also a deeply unsatisfying one for the men who had gone in without them. And then the gate opened. It happened in a street near an intersection, in the strange quiet that sometimes falls over a city that has just been fought through. A small group of soldiers was comparing notes, sharing information about who among their comrades had survived the push into the city and who had not. They were near a tall wooden fence when a gate in it, almost invisible against the planks, swung inward. A Russian officer in a long brown leather coat came through it fast and fired his revolver several times before anyone could respond. One of the soldiers, a man named Khan, was hit. The Russian slammed the gate and ran. The men gave chase, bursting through without thinking about what might be waiting on the other side. But the man was gone. There was no shot to be taken, no confrontation, no resolution. When they came back through the gate, Khan was on the ground with blood soaking through his undershirt. He was still alive for a moment, not for long. One of the soldiers offered a canvas raincoat to cover the body. Another said they would drag him to the fence, and someone would come for him later. That was the burial plan. That was what this war had room for. Later that same day, the task of identifying Khan's body at the field hospital fell to one of the soldiers in the group. The request came from a superior officer, framed as formality. What the soldier found when he arrived was something that sits in a strange and terrible category of wartime experience, the kind of detail that is almost impossible to process. A tank had broken through the fence during the advance and had run over Khan where he lay. And yet, despite everything, the man's face was still recognizable. Some essential features had survived what should have been total destruction. The soldier stared at that for a moment and moved on, because there was still cable to lay and orders to follow. The cable assignment led him past a machine gun crew near the train station, where the gunners were engaged with something that had initially looked like a military target. A Russian train was trying to leave the city, pulled by two heavy armored locomotives, venting great clouds of steam. A machine gun round sparked off the lead locomotive's plating. Then an artillery shell struck it, and the train stopped. Another shell hit the first freight car behind the engine and tore it apart. From an elevated position on a nearby hill, an 88mm anti-aircraft gun was firing freely at the stationary train with nothing to oppose it. Then the doors of the rear passenger cars flew open. People came out screaming, jumping from the cars onto the ground, and among them were women and children. The machine gunner stopped firing immediately. His jaw was tight. He said there were civilians everywhere, said it through his teeth. The soldier watching said, why didn't they run to the other side, where the gun couldn't reach them? The answer was that the 88mm crew on the hill could not see the civilians at that distance. They saw a train. They kept firing. The machine gunner called it what it was, a massacre. That thin line between military necessity and something that has no name you would want to use tearing open right in front of them. When it was over, a company commander arrived and the men went through the grim process of examining the dead. Documents found on the bodies told a specific story. The people in those rear passenger cars had been Soviet commissars and senior party officials who had been trying to escape the city with their families. What happens to a soldier who watches something like that and then has to go back to his duties? He goes back. That is what happens. He closes the loop in his mind as best he can and picks up the next assignment. In this case, the next assignment was a meeting with Battalion Commander Fritz Witt. The office was orderly. A large table held a map. 4 junior officers stood around it. In the corner, a German shepherd named Bully lay watching the room with calm brown eyes. Witt himself was a commanding presence, dressed with the kind of precision that seemed almost theatrical given the chaos outside, his Knight's Cross visible on his collar. The soldier reported, and Witt walked him to the window. Outside, 2 bridges over the Don were visible. One of the companies under an officer named Springer had crossed to the far bank and established a bridgehead, but contact with them had been lost. The assignment was simple and dangerous. Lay a telephone cable across the bridge to re-establish communication. But before the soldier was sent out, something happened that is worth understanding because it says something about the specific texture of life in this war. Wood ordered champagne. 5 bottles appeared, held by an officer who clearly had practiced carrying 3 in one hand. Corks came out. Glasses were filled. A toast was raised to the capture of Rostov and what it represented, a penetration of 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory. And the soldier stood in the corner at attention, without a drink. Wood noticed. He asked where the man's bottle was. When told that one had not been brought for him, Wood sent the officer back out for another and handed the soldier his own bottle and glass in the meantime. They would wait together until the 6th bottle arrived and then celebrate properly, all of them, in the middle of a destroyed city, with dead men behind fences and burning trains outside. The battalion commander was making sure a private soldier had a glass of champagne in his hand before the toast was finished. The cable laying began. The soldier was almost across the first large span of the railway bridge when Wood's voice called out from the office window behind him. "Come back immediately. Do not cross." The order arrived without explanation, and the soldier turned around and came back. Less than an hour later, the reason became clear. A handful of survivors from Springer's 3rd Company came back across the bridge. They were breathing hard, their breath turning to vapor in the cold air. One of them said they had walked into a trap. 6 men remained of the entire company. Springer himself had stayed behind in a signal bunker with a small group to hold position. It was Springer who had spotted the Russians moving on the bridgehead and thrown grenades to create a distraction, buying the survivors time to get back across. It was also Springer, almost certainly, who had seen what was happening in time to call the warning out to the soldier on the bridge. The order to come back had saved his life. Shortly after the battle, Springer was nominated for the Knight's Cross. Now think about where the German army was at this moment. They had pushed 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory. Rostov was taken. The Caucasian oil fields were theoretically within reach. It must have felt, in that brief window of early winter victory, like something historic was being achieved. And then the temperature dropped further and the whole picture changed. The Russian winter arrived in full force in the final days of November 1941. Supply lines that had been stretched thin for weeks snapped under the additional pressure of cold. Food stocks were low because the retreating Soviets had cleared out warehouses before leaving. Fuel was freezing in lines and tanks. To keep trucks running, drivers left engines idling for hours. To start an engine that had been off too long, some drivers built fires underneath the vehicle, which was exactly as dangerous as it sounds, but was sometimes the only option available. A driver from another platoon passed along information about a food warehouse near the train station. The soldiers moved on it quickly, slipping past the units who would have claimed to find for themselves, and inside they found canned goods, ham, rendered lard, oil, and honey. It was, by any measure of that moment, an extraordinary discovery. They loaded what they could onto the truck and headed back, losing a few cans over the side on a steep hill, but arriving with enough to address at least one of their immediate problems. The ammunition shortage was harder to solve. Russian forces were now crossing the Don in large numbers, and the Germans defending the riverbank had little to answer with. The situation was becoming unstable, and then a rumor moved through the ranks that confirmed what many had suspected. They would be retreating to defensive positions north of Taganrog, pulling back to the Mosambik line. This was the first retreat any of them had experienced in this campaign. And here is something the soldier noticed in his officer's behavior that he had never noticed before, something beneath the surface. A controlled but unmistakable edge that he later recognized as hidden panic. Because retreat is, as he understood it, a skill in itself. It is something you have to think through and plan for. And this army had never seriously discussed it or prepared for it. Now it was happening, and everyone was adapting in real time. The unit loaded onto a truck and moved west through falling snow. They caught up with the tail of the retreating column near a small town. And then, through the white and the cold, someone spotted something in the distance. A column of Russian tanks, moving on an angle that would bring them across the road ahead. They were trying to cut off the retreating German column. On the truck, the men processed this in silence for a moment. Then the engine coughed once and died. The truck rolled a few meters on inertia, tires crunching through fresh snow, and then stopped. In the quiet that followed, no one said what everyone was thinking. The cab door opened, and the driver jumped out, already moving with a wrench in his hand. He tapped the fuel tank and listened to the sound. The fuel itself was still liquid, but the fuel lines had frozen solid, and the engine could not draw from the tank. There was no time to build a fire under the truck. The Russian tanks were visible in the distance, and the column ahead was still moving. A soldier named Boris, who weeks earlier had saved several men by impersonating a Russian officer in a moment of extraordinary nerve, looked at the driver and asked a question. "Do you have a piece of hose?" The driver did, but not long enough to stretch from tank to engine. Boris had a different plan. He asked for every container available: gas mask canisters, water bottles, anything that could hold fuel. The driver inserted a rubber hose into the tank and tried to siphon, but his lips were too frozen to feel the difference between sucking and blowing. Boris took the hose from him, filled the containers, and walked them around to the front of the truck, feeding fuel directly to the engine through an improvised line. He climbed into the cab, held the hose in place near the fuel line, and told the driver to get behind the wheel. The men in the cargo bed looked at each other in the kind of silence that has its own particular weight. One soldier said he hoped the battery would not die before the engine caught. Another told him not to say things like that. The starter turned. The engine sputtered. It puffed. It resisted. And then it started, rough and cold but running. And the sound of it produced the kind of relief that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never been that afraid. The truck accelerated, rejoining the column, leaving the Russian tanks behind on another road. Think about what that moment actually was. Not a battle, not a tactical victory or a strategic gain, just a frozen fuel line, a piece of rubber hose, and a man with enough creativity and calm to figure out a solution while enemy armor moved in the distance. That is what survival looked like in this war. Not always a weapon, sometimes just a hose and someone steady enough to use it. The soldier whose account this comes from was not a general or a decorated hero. He was a private, laying cable, running messages, climbing in and out of trucks, watching men die near wooden fences, and identifying their bodies at field hospitals. He moved through historic events as an ordinary person moves through any catastrophic experience, one immediate problem at a time, with very little visibility into the larger picture. But that limited view is exactly what makes this account worth sitting with. History tends to zoom out to the level where individual people become statistics, or symbols, or footnotes. The Eastern Front becomes numbers, distances, temperatures. But somewhere inside those numbers was a man who noticed that an officer was good at carrying 3 bottles in one hand, who froze for a moment watching a dying man's lips move, who felt genuine relief when a cold engine finally turned over in the snow. Those details do not make the larger story easier or more comfortable. They make it harder to look away from. What strikes you most about accounts like this one? The way ordinary people navigate extraordinary and terrible circumstances, or the way history is written so differently from the inside than it looks from the outside? Drop your answer below. The truck kept moving west through the snow. The column kept retreating. And somewhere ahead was another line, another position, another winter morning with frozen ground and fog and orders that would put men in places where gates could swing open without warning and everything could change in a second. That is the thing about this kind of story. It does not end with a resolution. It ends with movement, cold air, a road disappearing into white, and the engine running 1 more kilometer than it should have been able to, which is sometimes all survival ever is. Some of you are already subscribed. Thank you, genuinely. If you are not yet, this is your sign. Join us. There is much more coming.